Caleb Whitaker dropped to his knees in the dirt the moment he saw it. The fence line his father had built with bleeding hands repaired. The cattle fat and grazing. The fields alive with crops he had never planted. 7 years. 7 years he had been gone chasing gold that never existed, while everything he abandoned somehow refused to die. And standing in the doorway of his father's house was a woman he had never seen before in his life. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The horse beneath him was half dead by the time Caleb Whitaker crossed back into the valley he had left 7 years ago. He hadn't told anyone he was coming. There was no one left to tell. His father's last letter had arrived 14 months ago, forwarded 3 times across mining camps and muddy river towns until it finally caught up with him in a saloon outside Bozeman. He hadn't opened it for 2 days. He told himself he was too tired. The truth was something he couldn't say out loud, then that he already knew somewhere deep in the place where a man keeps the things he can't face, that the letter wasn't good news. When he finally read it, the words were not from his father. They were from a neighbor named Holt, a cattle farmer 2 miles east of the Whitaker property. A man Caleb remembered only as the kind of person who minded his own business and expected others to do the same. "Your father passed the 14th of March, the letter said. He asked me to find a way to reach you. I'm sorry it took so long, that was all. No anger, no accusations, no list of everything Caleb had failed to do. Just a date. Just a fact. Just the kind of plain, quiet devastation that hits harder than shouting ever could." Caleb had sat with that letter in his hand for a long time. Then he folded it, put it in his coat pocket, walked back to his rented room above the saloon, lay down on the cot that smelled like tobacco and mildew, and stared at the ceiling until the sun came up. He did not cry that night. He wasn't sure he still knew how. He left Bozeman 3 days later with everything he owned, loaded onto one horse, which wasn't much. A bedroll, a change of clothes, a pistol with 4 bullets, a coin purse with less money in it than most men spent on a decent meal. 7 years of work and dreaming and suffering in the mining camps, and this was the total sum of what he had to show for it. He rode south toward home, feeling like a man walking to his own sentencing. The journey took 11 days. 11 days of open sky and dry grass, and the particular kind of silence that presses down on a man when he has too much to think about and nowhere to run from it. He stopped at creek beds to water the horse and refill his canteen. He cooked beans over small fires in the evenings and ate without tasting anything. He rehearsed in his head what he would say when he arrived, what explanation he might offer for the years of silence, for the missed letters, for the stubborn pride that had kept him away long past the point when he knew he should have come home. Every version he tried sounded hollow, because there was no explanation. Not really. There was only the truth, and the truth was that he had chosen gold over his father. He had chosen the idea of becoming someone important over the man who had already loved him exactly as he was. And no amount of words could dress that up into something less shameful than what it actually was. The Whitaker Ranch came into view on a Tuesday morning just after the sun had cleared the eastern ridgeline and begun throwing long gold light across the valley floor. Caleb stopped his horse at the top of the low hill that overlooked the property, and he stared. The fence line was whole. Every post straight, every rail in place, the wire tight and rust-free in a way that spoke of recent work and careful attention. The pasture beyond it held a small herd of cattle, not enormous, but healthy, their coats smooth, their movements easy. The vegetable garden along the south wall of the farmhouse had been worked recently. He could see the dark-turned earth from where he sat. The farmhouse itself stood solid. The roof had been patched in 2 places. He could see the newer shingles against the older weathered ones. The porch boards had been replaced on the left side. The door was painted a faded red that he did not remember his father ever choosing. None of this made sense. His father had been gone for over a year, according to Holt's letter. A ranch with no one running it didn't hold together like this. It fell apart. Caleb had seen it happen to other properties during his years in the territory. The way neglect moved through a place like a slow rot. the fences sagging, the animals wandering the fields, going to weed and hardpack. An unworked ranch looked like a place that had given up. This place did not look like it had given up. This place looked like someone was fighting for it. He rode down the hill slowly, his eyes moving across every corner of the property, trying to understand what he was seeing. By the time he reached the gate, his hand was tight on the reins and his jaw was set in a way he didn't entirely control. He dismounted and led the horse through the gate, and that was when the front door of the farmhouse opened. The woman who stepped out onto the porch was not anyone he recognized. She was perhaps 30, perhaps 35. It was difficult to say with certainty. She was a plus-size woman with a broad open face and dark hair pulled back from her neck, in the practical way of someone who worked with her hands and had no patience for hair that interfered with the job. She wore a plain work dress, heavy boots, and a canvas apron streaked with soil. She was carrying a cast-iron skillet in her right hand, which she lowered slightly when she saw him, though she did not set it down. She looked at him the way a person looks at a stranger who has arrived on their property without warning, steady, careful, not hostile exactly, but not welcoming either. Waiting. "This is private property," she said. Her voice was even. Not aggressive, but not soft. Caleb stopped walking. His horse shifted beside him, and he put a hand on the animal's neck without taking his eyes off the woman. "I know it is," he said. "It belonged to my father." Something moved across her face. Not surprise exactly. More like a rearrangement, a shift in how she was reading the situation. "Caleb Whitaker," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she set the skillet down on the porch railing carefully, like she was making a deliberate choice to do so. "Your father talked about you," she said. The words landed in the center of his chest, like something thrown hard. "I'd imagine he had reason to," Caleb said, because he didn't know what else to say, and honesty seemed like the only currency worth spending right now. "He did," the woman said. "But not the way you might be thinking." She came down the porch steps, then moving with the kind of unhurried confidence that Caleb associated with people who knew exactly where they stood and had stopped caring what others thought about it. She crossed the yard toward him and stopped about 6 feet away, close enough that he could see the steadiness in her eyes. "My name is Margaret Hayes," she said. "I worked for your father during the last years of his life. I've been keeping this place running since he passed." Caleb stood with that sentence for a moment. "Alone," he said. "Mostly." He looked around the yard end, the repaired fence, the watered garden, the cattle grazing in the pasture beyond. "How long?" he said. 3 years more or less. 2 before he passed and the year since. 3 years. A woman he had never met had spent 3 years keeping his family's land alive while he was panning gravel in rivers 400 miles north and coming up empty every single time. I didn't have words for what he felt in that moment. It wasn't a simple thing. It was layered shame and gratitude, and something close to grief, all pressing against each other in a way that made his throat tighten and his chest feel like someone was sitting on it. "Why?" he said, and he meant it as a full question, even though it only came out as one word. "Why would you do that? Why would a stranger take on that kind of work? What did you expect to get from it?" Margaret looked at him plainly. "Because your father asked me to," she said, "and because he was a good man who deserved to have his wishes honored." Caleb had to look away for a moment. He turned his face toward the pasture, toward the cattle that should not have been there by any reasonable logic, and he breathed. "I should have come home sooner," he said. He wasn't talking to her, not really, but she heard it. "Yes," she said. "You should have." She didn't say it cruelly. She didn't say it with satisfaction. She just said it the way you state something that is true and does not require softening. He turned back to her. "I owe you more than I can probably pay." "You don't owe me anything," Margaret said. "I made a promise. I kept it. That's between me and your father." "It's between you and me now," Caleb said, seeing as he's gone. She considered that for a moment. Then she nodded, a single small movement, like she was filing the statement away for later consideration. "You hungry?" she said. He was. He hadn't eaten since the previous morning. "Yes, ma'am." Then come inside, Margaret said. I'll tell you what's been happening with this place, and you can decide what you want to do about it. She turned and walked back toward the farmhouse, and Caleb looped his horse's reins over the fence post and followed her. The inside of the farmhouse was familiar and strange. At the same time, the bones of the place were exactly as he remembered the layout of the rooms, the height of the ceilings, the particular way the light came through the east window in the mornings. But the details had changed. His father's old furniture had been rearranged to make better use of the space. There were practical additions, a second shelf along the kitchen wall, a wooden rack beside the door for tools and boots, a small writing desk in the corner with a neat stack of ledger books on top of it. His father had never kept ledger books. His father had kept everything in his head, which had worked well enough until it hadn't. Margaret moved through the kitchen with the ease of someone who knew exactly where everything was because she had put it all there herself. She set water to boiling and pulled leftover biscuits from a cloth and began slicing salt pork into a pan without asking him any questions or requiring him to make conversation while she worked. He found that he was grateful for that. He sat at the kitchen table, which was the same table he had sat at as a boy, and he looked at his hands. They were rough. The years in the mining camps had left their marks. The calluses, the small white scars from picking work and sharp rock. The permanent dark lines in the creases of his knuckles that no amount of washing seemed to fully remove. Miner's hands. They looked like hands that had worked hard and come up with nothing. I thought about his father's hands. Thomas Whitaker had hands that looked like something carved from old wood, enormous, scarred, powerful, even in old age. Ranchers' hands. Hands that built fences and pulled calves and held the reins of difficult horses and never once let go of anything that mattered to him, except his son had let go of him. Tell me about him, Caleb said. At the end, if you don't mind. Margaret didn't pause in what she was doing. He was in pain some days, she said. His lungs. But he didn't complain much. He'd sit on the porch in the mornings and watch the pasture. Was he angry? Caleb said. With me. Margaret put the skillet on the fire and turned to look at him. No, she said. I asked him once early on, not exactly in those words, but close enough. He said anger was a waste of the time he had left. That sounds like him, Caleb said. He kept a photograph of you, Margaret said. From when you were young. He had it on the windowsill in his room. Something in Caleb's chest cracked open. He pressed his mouth together and looked at the table. Did he? He stopped, started again. Did he think I was coming back before the end? Margaret was quiet for a moment. The salt pork sizzled. Yes, she said. He thought you were coming back every spring. Caleb closed his eyes. Every spring. His father sitting on that porch watching the road into the valley. Every spring expecting to see his son coming down the hill. And every spring, the road had stayed empty. I was a fool, Caleb said. His voice was flat, not emotional the way a man sounds when he's moved past emotion into something harder and colder, where the truth just sits in plain sight with nowhere left to hide. You were young, Margaret said, and stubborn, and you wanted something badly enough to make bad decisions about how to get it. She set a plate in front of him. Biscuits, salt pork, a tin cup of black coffee. That doesn't make you unique, Mr. Whitaker. It makes you human. He looked up at her. You're being very generous, he said, given what I did. I'm being honest, she said. Generous would be pretending it wasn't as bad as it was. I'm not going to do that. He almost smiled. It surprised him he hadn't thought he had a smile anywhere in him right now. Fair enough, he said. He ate. Margaret poured herself a cup of coffee and sat across the table from him and began telling him about the ranch with the same practical efficiency she seemed to bring to everything. She went through it all: the cattle, the state of the pasture grass, the roof repairs she had managed with help from Holt's oldest boy, the fencing she had done herself over the course of 2 winters, the garden, the well, the condition of the outbuildings. She spoke about all of it with precision. Numbers, seasons, problems encountered, and solutions found. She had kept records of it. That was what the ledger books were. Every expense, every repair, every decision made on behalf of a property that wasn't hers. Caleb listened and felt the shame of it settle deeper into him with every word. Not because she was saying anything cruel, she wasn't. She was saying it all matter-of-factly, the way a person reports on a job they were assigned and completed competently. But every sentence was a reminder of what had been happening here on this land, while he was somewhere else, failing at something that had never been worth the cost. "There's one more thing," Margaret said when she had finished the accounting. "Tell me." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "About 2 months ago, a man named Richard Caldwell came around. He's a land speculator, buys up properties that are distressed or in dispute. He's been watching this place for a while, I think, since your father passed." Caleb set down his fork. "What did he want?" "He made an offer on the ranch," Margaret said. "He said that since Thomas died without his heir present, and since the property had been maintained by a—" She paused, choosing the word carefully. "A non-family party. There might be questions about the legal standing of the claim." "Questions," Caleb repeated. His word, not mine. "And what did you tell him?" Margaret looked at him steadily. "I told him that Thomas Whitaker's son was alive, and that this property belonged to him, and that if he came back onto this land without an invitation, I would personally introduce him to the business end of a shotgun." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Did you have a shotgun?" "I do now," Margaret said. "I bought one the week after." This time he did smile. He couldn't help it. It was a real one, brief, tired, but real. "He'll come back," Caleb said. "Almost certainly," Margaret agreed. "Men like Caldwell always do. They wait for the moment when a person is tired or desperate or feels like fighting isn't worth it anymore. Then they make their move." "He's going to find this particular moment disappointing," Caleb said. Margaret looked at him, a long, appraising look, the kind that measured something, and came back with a result she hadn't fully expected. "Are you planning to stay?" she said. The question was direct. She wasn't soft-pedaling it or wrapping it in politeness. She wanted a straight answer. Caleb looked at the kitchen around him. At the table his father had eaten breakfast at for 40 years. At the window that faced east where his father had watched the road. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "Not again." Margaret held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded. "Then we have work to do," she said. "First thing tomorrow, I'll walk you through everything that still needs attention. There's a section of the north pasture fence that's been giving me trouble, and the barn roof is going to need work before winter." "I'll be up before dawn," Caleb said. "Good." She stood and began clearing the table. "Your father's room is yours. I've been sleeping in the back room. I can move if you'd prefer the space." "I won't take your room," Caleb said. "You've earned it more than I have." She paused with the plates in her hands and looked at him again with that measuring look. "You're going to have to stop saying things like that," she said, "or you're going to make it very difficult for me to stay irritated at you." "Are you irritated at me?" "I've been irritated at you for 3 years," Margaret said simply. "A man I'd never met, and I was irritated at him. Your father thought that was funny." Caleb felt the words hit somewhere soft and unprotected. "I reckon he would," he said quietly. Margaret carried the dishes to the wash basin. "He also thought you'd come back and make things right," she set her back to him. "He was confident about that. I wasn't sure I agreed with him." A pause. "I'm starting to think he knew something I didn't." That night, Caleb lay on the cot in the back room. He hadn't been able to bring himself to sleep in his father's bed, not yet, and stared at the ceiling in the dark. Outside the valley was quiet, in the way that only truly open country can be quiet, a vast and encompassing stillness, broken only by the occasional call of an owl somewhere in the cottonwoods along the creek. "I thought about 7 years." He laid them out in his mind like stones on a flat surface one after another and looked at them. Year 1. The first mining camp. The initial excitement. The conviction that fortune was just around the next bend in the river. The brutal cold of his first Montana winter, spent in a canvas tent with 4 other men who smelled like wet dog and bad decisions. Year 2. The first real failure. The claim he had invested everything in, worked for 8 months, produced almost nothing. The feeling of the ground shifting under his certainty. Year 3. A second camp, a new stake. The desperate energy of a man who has begun to understand that he is losing but cannot stop because stopping means admitting that he was wrong when he left. Year 4. A letter from his father that he read and did not answer. Pride. Year 5. Another letter. Guilt. Still no answer. More pride. The way one feeds the other. Year 6. The year. He stopped getting letters, which should have been a signal, but which he found a way to rationalize his father was busy. The mail was unreliable. Things were probably fine. Year 7. The letter from Holt. The date in March. The fold of the paper in his coat pocket that he still carried. He reached into the coat hanging on the hook beside the cot and took the letter out in the dark. He held it without unfolding it. He didn't need to read it again. He had it memorized. He had wasted 7 years. He had wasted his father's last years of health. His father's final wish to see his son come home. The quiet daily reality of a man who went on believing in his boy, even when his boy had given him no reason to. And while all of that was happening, a woman his father had trusted with his most important request had been out here in the cold and the heat and the work of it, keeping faith with a promise made to a dying man. He owed Margaret Hayes a debt he had no idea how to pay, but he was going to try. The next morning he was up before the sun. He pulled on his boots in the dark and walked out to the barn and began feeding the horses before Margaret appeared in the barn doorway with a lantern in one hand and a look of mild surprise on her face. "You actually meant it," she said. "I said before dawn," he said. "It's before dawn." She considered him for a moment in the lamplight, taking in the fact of him there, already working, without needing to be told what to do or how. "The north fence is half a mile up the ridge," she said. "I'll show you after breakfast." "Show me now," he said. "We can eat after." Something shifted in her expression. Not softness exactly. More like a door that had been locked being quietly, carefully unlocked. "All right," she said. "Get the tools from the back wall." They worked side by side as the sun came up over the eastern ridge, Margaret pointing out the problem sections of the fencing, Caleb following her direction without argument or pride. She knew this land. She knew it better than he did, better he suspected than he ever had, even when he was a boy growing up on it. She moved through it with the familiarity of someone who had learned it through years of daily contact, who knew where the ground went soft after a hard rain and where the cattle liked to press against the wire in summer. He listened to her. He watched the way she worked. He didn't offer opinions he hadn't earned. By mid-morning, they had fixed 3 sections of fence. Margaret worked as hard as he did, harder in some respects, because she was doing it with a precision and efficiency that came from knowing exactly what needed to be done. She didn't waste motion. She didn't second-guess herself. During a pause in the work, while Caleb was twisting wire and Margaret was checking the tension on the post they'd just set, he said, "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask," she said. "How did you end up at my father's place before all this? How did you come to be working for him?" Margaret was quiet for a moment, testing the fence wire with one gloved hand. "I lost my own place," she said. "Small farm west of here. My husband and I ran it together for 6 years. He died. Without him, I couldn't keep up with it. The bank was patient for a while, and then they weren't, and I had to walk away." Caleb set down the wire pliers and looked at her. "I'm sorry," he said. "It was hard," she said evenly. "But it taught me things. About what matters. About what a person can do when they have no choice but to figure it out." She looked at the fence. "Your father heard about my situation from someone in town. He asked Holt to reach out to me. Said he needed help and couldn't pay much, but that there was room and board and that he was easy to work for." "Was he?" A real smile crossed her face, then the first one he'd seen from her. It changed her completely, opened her face into something warmer than the careful steadiness she wore like armor. "He was the easiest man I ever worked for," she said, "and one of the kindest I ever met." "He was a good man," Caleb said. The words came out rough. "He was," Margaret agreed. "And he loved you, Mr. Whitaker, even when it probably would have been easier not to." Caleb looked out at the valley below the ranch, the pasture, the farmhouse with its red door. "I know," he said. "That's the part that's hardest to live with." They walked back down to the farmhouse in the mid-morning light, tools in hand, the fence behind them, holding steady against the open sky. A hawk moved in a wide circle above the ridge. Somewhere in the pasture, one of the cattle made a sound that carried clean and clear across the quiet air. Caleb looked at the fence they'd fixed at the cattle at the buildings his father had built with his own hands. He had come back here expecting ruins, expecting the evidence of everything he had destroyed by leaving. Instead, he had found this something living, something preserved against all reason. He had found Margaret Hayes, who had no obligation to any of it, and had chosen it anyway. And somewhere in the back of his mind, in the place where the cold certainty of his failures lived, something was beginning very slowly, very carefully to shift. He didn't have a name for it yet, but it felt like the first honest thing he had felt in 7 years. He said nothing. He didn't need to. He just picked up his tools and walked toward the barn to put them away, and Margaret walked beside him, and the morning light lay golden and wide across everything his father had ever loved. Richard Caldwell rode onto the Whitaker ranch 3 days after Caleb came home. He didn't knock. Men like Caldwell never knocked. They rode up to the fence line and stopped their horses in a way that was designed to communicate something that they were accustomed to being received, that the land beneath them was already in some essential sense theirs to evaluate. He had 2 men with him, both large, both quiet, in the particular way of men who were paid to be present rather than to speak. Caleb was in the barn when he heard the horses. He came out into the yard wiping his hands on a rag, and he saw Caldwell sitting on a gray gelding at the gate, well dressed for a man who claimed to be a rancher, his coat too clean and his boots too polished for someone who actually worked in the dirt. Margaret came out of the farmhouse behind Caleb. He heard the door and heard her stop on the porch. "Mr. Whitaker, I presume," Caldwell said. He had the voice of someone who had spent years practicing how to sound reasonable and warm. "Richard Caldwell, I've been hoping to make your acquaintance." "I know who you are," Caleb said. He didn't move toward the gate. He stood in the middle of the yard and let the distance say what it needed to say. Caldwell smiled. "Then you know I've been trying to help your family through a difficult situation. I had a conversation with Mrs. Hayes some months back. I hope she passed along my interest." "She passed it along," Caleb said. "I understand you suggested there might be legal questions about the property." "Not my words exactly," Caldwell said easily. "I was only pointing out the reality of the situation. A ranch that's been maintained by a non-family party with no formal arrangement for a significant period of time. These things can become complicated. I was trying to offer a solution before it became a problem." "The only complication I'm looking at right now," Caleb said, "is a man who showed up on my land without being invited." The smile on Caldwell's face didn't waver. He had probably been told no by men angrier than Caleb and had learned not to let it touch him. "I understand the defensiveness," Caldwell said. "I do. You've come home to a situation that's, well, let's be honest, not entirely straightforward. 7 years away, your father's gone, a woman running your operation, debts that have likely accrued. I'm not your enemy, Mr. Whitaker. I'm a man with resources who can make this easier for you." "What debts?" Caleb said. Caldwell tilted his head. "Well, the cost of maintaining a property over several years. Feed, supplies, repairs. These things add up even when a person is generous enough to absorb them without complaint." He glanced toward Margaret on the porch. "And generosity has limits, doesn't it, Mrs. Hayes?" Margaret said nothing. Her face was still. Caleb took 1 step toward the gate. Just one. But something in it made Caldwell's horse shift under him. "Mr. Caldwell," Caleb said, "I'm going to say this once and I'd like you to hear it clearly. This ranch belongs to the Whitaker family. I am the Whitaker family. There are no debts here that need settling by the sale of land. There is no legal question that concerns you. And what Mrs. Hayes has done for this property was done out of loyalty to my father, and I will be repaying it appropriately in a way that does not involve you in any capacity whatsoever." Caldwell studied him for a moment. The pleasantness was still in his face, but it had thinned slightly at the edges. "You sound very certain for a man who just got back," Caldwell said. "I am certain," Caleb said. "The gate's behind you." Caldwell held his gaze for a moment longer. Then he gathered his reins and turned the gray gelding in a slow, deliberate arc, A man who wanted to make clear that he was leaving on his own terms, not being driven. "I'll be in touch," he said as he rode toward the road. "I won't be looking forward to it," Caleb said. He stood in the yard and watched until Caldwell and his 2 men had crested the low hill and disappeared. Then he turned around. Margaret was still on the porch. She was looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before, not exactly approval, but something adjacent to it. Something that said she had watched the exchange and found it satisfactory. "He mentioned debts," Caleb said. "Is there anything I should know about money you've spent on this place?" "I kept records," Margaret said. "All of it's in the ledger books." "I know. I looked at them last night." She came down the porch steps. And you spent a significant amount of your own money on this property over 3 years," Caleb said. "Money you didn't have to spend. Money you couldn't afford to lose." Margaret stopped a few feet from him. "I managed. That's not the point." He met her eyes directly. "I'm going to pay it back. All of it." "Caleb, don't argue with me about this," he said. It was the first time he had used her name without the formality, and he heard it register in the small pause that followed. "You have every right to be paid back. What you did here, the money you spent, the years you put in, that's not charity. That was labor. Your labor, your money. And I'm going to make it right." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. The steadiness in her eyes shifted, not breaking, but adjusting the way water adjusts when something solid is placed into it. "All right," she said. "I also want to talk to you about a more permanent arrangement," Caleb said. "If you're willing. I don't have the knowledge to run this ranch on my own. I've been gone too long. You know this land better than I do. I'd like you to stay on as a proper partner in the operation, not as a caretaker. Equal share in decisions. And I'll get that in writing if you want it." She was quiet for a moment. The morning air moved around them, and somewhere in the pasture one of the cattle made a low sound. "Why?" she said. "Because it's the right thing to do," Caleb said. "And because I'm trying to become someone who does the right thing before it's too late." Margaret looked at him steadily. Then she said, "I'll think about it." He nodded. It was enough for now. What neither of them knew that morning was that Richard Caldwell was not the kind of man who accepted a single refusal as a final answer. He was the kind of man who came at a problem from multiple angles, who had spent enough years acquiring land to understand that the first obstacle was rarely the real obstacle. The real obstacle was always something underneath it, a weakness, a pressure point, a crack that hadn't opened yet. He spent the next several days in town, doing what men like Caldwell did best. He talked to people. He asked questions in the way that seemed like casual conversation. He had a drink at the saloon and let information come to him the way it always did, in small towns where people talked, because silence made them uncomfortable and gossip moved faster than truth. Within a week, he had a clearer picture of the situation at the Whitaker ranch. He knew about Caleb's 7 years in the mining camps and his empty pockets. He knew about Margaret's background, the farm she'd lost, the years she'd spent as a caretaker, the way the town regarded her with a mix of grudging respect and comfortable dismissal. He knew she was not from money and had no powerful connections. And he learned one more thing, something he filed away with particular care. There was a question, apparently, about a small loan Thomas Whitaker had taken out in his final year. A loan from a private creditor, not a bank, a man named Amos Birch, who operated out of the next town east and whose terms were generous up front and punishing at the back end. Thomas had borrowed against the ranch to pay for a costly repair to the well. The original structure had collapsed, and replacing it had taken most of a season's income. He had planned to repay the loan from that year's cattle sales. He had died before the cattle sold. The debt had never been formally recorded against the property because Birch had been in no hurry. He was the patient kind. He let interest accumulate the way some men let weeds grow, knowing that eventually the ground would be so choked with it that the original problem would be unrecognizable beneath all the mess that followed. Caldwell paid Birch a visit. 2 days later, Caleb received a formal letter. He found it on the kitchen table when he came in from the morning's work. Margaret had brought the mail in from the box at the road and left it there without comment, which told him she had probably seen the name on the envelope, Amos Birch Creditor, with a return address in the town of Millhaven, and understood what it meant. Caleb sat down and read the letter. It was polite. It was also devastating. The original loan amount which his father had borrowed in good faith had grown substantially over 18 months of accrued interest at a rate that most reasonable people would have called criminal. The letter gave him 60 days to repay the full amount or face a formal claim against the property. He sat with it for a moment. Then he set it down on the table. Margaret was standing at the wash basin with her back to him. She hadn't asked. She was waiting. "How much did you know about this?" Caleb said. She turned around. "I knew your father had borrowed money for the well. He told me about it. He didn't tell me the terms of the loan. I don't think he fully understood them himself at the time. By the time I realized how the debt had grown, Birch hadn't contacted the ranch directly, so I didn't know exactly what the number was." "It's significant," Caleb said. "How significant?" he told her. Margaret was still for a moment. Then she pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. "Caldwell," she said. "Almost certainly," Caleb said. "The timing is too neat. Caldwell asks questions around town, finds out about the debt, pays Birch, whatever it costs to light a fire under it, and now we have 60 days to come up with money we don't have. Do we have any options?" Caleb rubbed a hand over his jaw. He'd been up since before 5, and the tiredness was in him now, the kind that came not just from physical work, but from the constant pressure of problems arriving before the previous ones were resolved. "The cattle sale in the fall would cover some of it," he said. "Not all, not even close." He looked at the letter. "We need to find a way to prove this debt is being manipulated. If Caldwell bought the debt or arranged to have it called in there, maybe a legal remedy." "Do you know a lawyer?" "I know a man in Billings," Caleb said. "He did business with my father years ago. I'll write to him today." "What do we do in the meantime?" Caleb picked up the letter and held it. "We work," he said. "We don't give Caldwell the satisfaction of watching us panic." What followed was the hardest stretch of weeks Caleb had spent since the worst winters in the mining camps, and those had been genuinely terrible. He wrote to the lawyer in Billings, a man named Harlan Cole, who wrote back within 10 days with a careful, measured assessment that was more encouraging than Caleb had dared hope. Cole believed there was a case to be made. The interest rate on Birch's loan bordered on usurious by any standard of fair dealing, and if it could be shown that Caldwell had intervened to accelerate the claim, there were grounds to challenge the timeline. But these things took time. Legal processes moved at their own pace, which was slow, and the 60-day window was not slowing with them. Caleb spent those weeks working the ranch harder than he had worked anything in his life. He was not skilled. Not yet. Margaret was the skilled one, and he knew it, and did not pretend otherwise. But he was willing, and he was present, and he brought to the work a kind of desperate, focused energy that surprised even himself. He was up before sunrise every morning. He was the last one in at night. He learned from Margaret, watched how she made decisions about the cattle, about the rotation of the pasture grass, about which repairs were urgent and which could wait. He asked questions and listened to the answers without interrupting, which was something he had not always been good at, and slowly, in ways he couldn't entirely track, the ranch began to respond. It was not dramatic. It was not the sudden discovery of gold. It was the quiet arithmetic of consistent effort, fences holding cattle healthy. The fall sale, looking more promising than it had looked in the spring when the operation had been running on Margaret's labor alone, and the numbers had been tight, Margaret noticed. She didn't say much about it, but he caught it in small things, the way she stopped double-checking his work on the fence lines, the way she began including him in decisions she'd previously made, unilaterally, the way she occasionally, very rarely smiled at something he said, without seeming to catch herself first. It was in the middle of this period, 3 weeks into the 60 days, with the pressure of the debt still squeezing, and the lawyer's correspondence still moving too slowly, that the second thing happened. Caleb was in town to pick up supplies when he overheard the conversation. He was at the general store waiting for the owner to tally up his order when 2 women came in from the street and began talking to each other in the way that people sometimes did in small spaces when they forgot or didn't care that other people could hear them. One of them he didn't know. The other was the wife of a man named Peters, who ran the feed store across the street, and who had apparently known his father well enough to have opinions about what was happening at the Whitaker ranch. "She's still out there," the Peters woman said, setting a basket on the counter. "Margaret Hayes, living with the Whitaker boy now." "Well," said the other woman, "I'm sure she's made herself comfortable enough. She always did know how to make herself necessary." "There's a word for women like that," the Peters woman said. The store owner behind the counter had gone very still. He was not looking at Caleb. He was looking at the wall with the focused attention of a man who very much did not want to be involved in whatever was about to happen. Caleb turned around. The two women looked at him. The Peters woman went a shade paler. The other one straightened her back. "Ladies," Caleb said. He kept his voice even. He had learned in the mining camps that the quieter a man spoke when he was angry, the more effectively the anger landed. "I didn't catch your names." "Mr. Whitaker," the Peters woman said, recovering her composure. We were just—" "I heard what you were just," Caleb said. "I'm going to be direct with you, because I think you deserve the respect of honesty more than you deserve me pretending I didn't hear it." He took one step toward them, unhurried, and put both hands in his coat pockets. "Margaret Hayes spent 3 years keeping my family's land alive out of loyalty to my father and honor for a promise she made him. She has done nothing, not one single thing that deserves the kind of talk I just heard. Not from you, not from anyone." The Peters woman opened her mouth. "I'm not finished," Caleb said quietly. "She is a good woman doing honest work, and I will not stand in any room in this town and listen to her name being used as a punchline. Not today, not ever." He held the woman's gaze until she looked away. "I'd like to think that the people my father called his neighbors are better than what I just heard. I'd like to give you both the benefit of that doubt." He waited a beat. "I'm going to ask you to give me a reason to." He turned back to the counter. The store owner looked relieved. "I'll take those supplies," Caleb said. He loaded the wagon in silence and drove back to the ranch with his jaw tight and something burning in his chest that took him a while to identify. It wasn't just anger. It was something older and deeper, the particular fury of a man who has watched someone he respects be dismissed by people who are not fit to carry her boots. He pulled up to the farmhouse, and Margaret came out to help unload. She took one look at his face and said, "What happened?" "Nothing you need to worry about," Caleb said. "Caleb." He met her eyes. She had learned in the weeks since his return to use the straightness of her look as a question in itself, a look that said she was not going to be managed or sidestepped, and that he might as well just tell her. He told her. Margaret listened without expression. When he was finished, she was quiet for a moment, her hands still on the side of the wagon. "I know what people say about me," she said. "I've known for a long time." "It's not right," Caleb said. "No," she said. "It isn't." She picked up a sack of flour and set it over her shoulder. "But I stopped letting it be the thing that determined my day about 2 years ago. The fences still need mending whether or not Ruth Peters thinks I belong here." He looked at her and the straightness of her back and the steadiness of her voice and the absolute absence of self-pity in anything about her. "How do you do that?" he said. "Do what?" "Keep going. When people talk like that. When it's hard. How do you just keep going?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. She looked at the sack of flour in her hands, then at him. "Because stopping," she said, "is how they win. And I have never once in my life given anyone the satisfaction of watching me quit." She met his eyes directly. "Your father understood that. He used to say that the land doesn't care who doubts you. The land only cares if you show up and do the work." Caleb looked at the farmhouse. At the red door his father had never painted. "Who painted that door?" he said. Margaret followed his gaze. A small pause. "I did," she said. "Your father said he'd always meant to paint it. He just never got around to it." Another pause. "I figured a house should look like somebody loves it." Caleb looked at the red door for a long moment. Something shifted in him. Finally, all the way. Something that had been loosening slowly since the morning he arrived and found the fences repaired and the cattle healthy, and a woman he didn't know, standing on his father's porch with a cast-iron skillet in her hand, holding the line. "He would have liked it," Caleb said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. I know, Margaret said. She walked past him toward the farmhouse. Come on, supper's not going to make itself. The letter from Harlan Cole arrived 12 days before the deadline. Cole had done his work carefully. He had obtained records showing that Caldwell had been in correspondence with Birch's business associate in the weeks before the debt was called in, not enough to prove outright collusion in a court, Cole said, but enough to make Birch significantly nervous about the scrutiny that a formal claim would bring. Cole had written to Birch directly outlining what he had found and what he intended to do with it if the matter proceeded to formal dispute. Birch had written back within 4 days. He was apparently prepared to renegotiate. Caleb read Cole's letter twice at the kitchen table. Margaret read it after him. They sat across from each other in silence for a moment. He's backing down, Caleb said. For now, Margaret said. He'll restructure the terms. We still owe the original amount. We can cover it with the fall sale, Caleb said. I talked to Holt about buying 3 head at a premium. He wants breeding stock and ours are good. That plus the regular sale gets us close enough. Close enough isn't covered, Margaret said. I have some money, he said. She looked at him. Not much, he said, but enough to close the gap if we're careful. He held her gaze. I was saving it. I wasn't sure for what. Now I know. Margaret looked at the letter. She pressed her lips together, not with emotion exactly, but with the particular expression of someone who is accepting a reality that required them to release something they had been holding for a long time. All right, she said. All right. All right, she said again. We handle the debt, we close the gap, and then, she paused, and then we figure out what comes next. What do you want to come next? Caleb said. It was a genuine question. Not rhetorical, not polite. He asked it the way he had learned to ask her things directly without dressing it up, because she responded to directness in a way she didn't respond to anything softer. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the table at her hands, then at him. I want this place to be real, she said. Not something I'm managing for someone else, not something I'm holding together until the actual person shows up. Something, she stopped. Something that belongs to you, Caleb said. She looked at him. A real partner, he said. Not on paper. Actually, both of us building it. He held her gaze. I meant it when I said it before, and I mean it more now. The silence between them was long. Outside the evening was settling, and the sounds of the ranch at dusk drifted through the window. The cattle, the horses in the barn, the wind moving through the cottonwoods by the creek. Why does that matter to you? Margaret said. Her voice was quieter than usual. Not guarded exactly, something more careful than guarded, something more real. Caleb thought about how to answer that honestly. Because you are the best person I have met in my entire life, he said. And that is not flattery. I have met a lot of people over the last 7 years in camps and towns and on the trail, and not one of them did what you did. Not for a dying old man they barely knew. Not for a son who didn't deserve it. Not for a piece of land that had no guarantee of being worth the sacrifice. He kept his eyes on her face. You did that. And you did it because you decided it mattered regardless of what anyone else thought. I don't know how a person becomes that solid, that sure about what they owe the world. But I know I am a better man for having watched you do it. Margaret did not look away from him. Caleb, she said. I'm not asking for anything, he said quickly. This isn't... He stopped. Tried again. I just want you to know why your partnership means more to me than just having someone who knows the land. It's because I don't entirely trust my own judgment yet. 7 years of bad decisions will do that to a man. But I trust yours. And that... He stopped again. That's not a small thing. The silence after that was different from the silences before. It had something in it. Not resolution. They were not at resolution. But something that had been separated was beginning very slowly to move toward the same place. Margaret stood up from the table and walked to the window. She stood there with her arms crossed, looking out at the last of the daylight on the valley. There's something I haven't told you, she said. Caleb waited. When your father was very close to the end, she said, he asked me to stay. Not just to manage the ranch. He asked me to stay to be here when you came home. He said, She paused. He said he didn't know when you'd come back or what shape you'd be in, but that he knew you'd need someone who wouldn't lie to you. She turned to look at him. He said he'd seen enough of the world to know that the people who tell a man the truth when it hurts are worth more than gold. Caleb could not speak for a moment. He knew I was coming back, he said finally. He never doubted it, Margaret said. Not once, not even when he was very sick, and it had been years with no letter. He said, her voice tightened, slightly controlled. Caleb will come home. He just hasn't run out of wrong roads yet. The sentence sat in the kitchen air between them like something physical. Caleb looked at his hands on the table. The miner's hands. The hands that had spent 7 years digging for something that was never going to be there, while his father sat on a porch and watched a road and waited with a patience that humbled him so completely he didn't have words for it. He was right, Caleb said. His voice was very low. I just had to run out of road. Yes, Margaret said. She turned back to the window. The last light was fading on the valley. The ranch was settling into its evening sounds. I'll stay, she said quietly. As a partner. Whatever that means going forward, I'll stay. Caleb closed his eyes for just a moment. Then he opened them, and the evening was still there, and the ranch was still there, and Margaret was still standing at the window, and outside the door was all the work that still needed doing. The debt to clear the cattle to bring through the fall, the land to tend and repair and grow back into what it had once been and could be again. He pushed back his chair and stood up. Thank you, he said. She didn't turn around, but he heard it in her voice when she answered something, unlocked, something aloud. Don't thank me, she said. Just show up tomorrow. I will, Caleb said. He walked to the door and the evening opened around him, and somewhere out in the dark pasture, the cattle moved through the grass with the comfortable indifference of animals that did not know or care that the world had just shifted quietly on its axis. Birch signed the restructured agreement on a Thursday morning, and by Friday, the news had moved through town, the way news always moved in small places, carried on the breath of people who had nothing to do with it and everything to say about it. Caleb heard the reaction in pieces. A nod from Holt when he came by to finalize the cattle deal. A look from the man behind the counter at the hardware store, not unfriendly, but reassessing the look of someone revising an opinion they'd formed too quickly. A comment from old Devereaux, who ran the feed mill and had known Thomas Whitaker for 30 years, who stopped Caleb on the road and said without ceremony, "Your father would be glad you came home, son." Then walked on before Caleb could find an answer. It wasn't celebration. It wasn't vindication. It was something quieter than both the slow, grudging shift of a community that had written off a man and was now recalculating. Caleb didn't need their approval, but he noticed it the way a man notices a change in weather, not because he was waiting for it, but because it changed the feel of the air around him. What mattered more was what was happening at the ranch. Margaret had taken him at his word about the partnership. Not all at once, that was not her way, and he was beginning to understand her ways more clearly now. The patterns beneath the steadiness, the careful architecture of how she let people in. She moved incrementally, testing each plank before she put her full weight on it. But she was moving. She began including him in decisions she'd previously made alone. Not asking permission, asking opinion, which was different, which was better. She'd come to him in the evenings with a question about the pasture rotation, or a concern about one of the older cows, and she'd listen while he thought out loud, and then she'd tell him where his reasoning was wrong, or where it held up. It was the best kind of education, the kind that happened in the middle of actual life, where the stakes were real and the feedback was immediate. How was learning the land? Slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. And somewhere in the daily work of that learning, something else was happening that neither of them named, and both of them felt. It announced itself in small moments. The morning she laughed at something he said, really laughed, unexpected and unguarded. The kind of laugh a person doesn't manufacture, and the way he held that sound in his chest for the rest of the day, like something worth keeping. The evening she sat across from him at the kitchen table with a ledger book between them, and fell asleep mid-sentence, just tipped forward with exhaustion, and he sat very still for a long time, because he didn't want to wake her. And he didn't entirely understand why, only that the sight of her wresting the tension out of her face, The armor down moved him in a way that arithmetic couldn't account for. I didn't say anything about any of it. He wasn't sure he had the right to, and he wasn't sure he understood it well enough to put it into words that wouldn't come out wrong. But he noticed. He noticed everything. What broke the quiet was Caldwell. It was always Caldwell. The man had backed down on the debt, but he had not gone away. That was the thing about men like Caldwell. They were patient in the way of predators, circling at a distance, watching for the moment when the prey made a mistake, or let its guard slip, or simply got tired of holding a defensive position. They didn't need to win today. They just needed to wait until today became some other day, when conditions had shifted in their favor. Caleb had known it was coming. He just didn't know what shape it would take. It came on a day, 3 weeks after the Birch matter was settled, and it came not from Caldwell directly, but from the town, which was where Caldwell did his best and most effective work. A man named Fletcher, who owned one of the larger operations in the valley, and who had enough social weight that people listened when he talked, called a meeting at the church hall. It was framed as a community meeting about land use and water rights, which was a real issue in the valley and a legitimate reason to gather. But Caleb heard about it from Holt the day before, and Holt's face when he mentioned it said more than his words. "You should go," Holt said. "Bring Margaret." "Why?" Holt was quiet for a moment. "Because Caldwell's going to be there, and because some things that are said about people in rooms where those people aren't present have a way of becoming accepted truth, whether they're true or not." Caleb understood. He told Margaret that evening. He watched her face while he explained what Holt had said, and he saw the way she processed it, the slight tightening around her eyes, the small pause before she responded, the controlled breath that was the closest she came to showing that something had gotten through the armor. "He's going to use the meeting to say things about the ranch," she said. "About us." "That's what I think." "And you want to go and face it directly." "I think we have to," Caleb said. "If we don't show, we leave the room to him." Margaret looked at this table. A long moment passed. "All right," she said. "We go." The church hall was full when they arrived. More full than Caleb had expected. The water rights issue was genuine enough to bring people out. But he suspected Caldwell had also done some quiet encouraging. He was already there when Caleb and Margaret walked in, standing near the front with Fletcher dressed well relaxed in the way of a man who believed he controlled the room. He watched them enter. His expression didn't change, but his eyes moved to Margaret and stayed there for just a beat too long. They found seats near the back. The meeting opened with Fletcher explaining the water rights issue, a legitimate concern about a tributary that fed several properties, including the Whitaker ranch, and questions about rights that had never been formally documented. Caleb listened carefully. It was real. It mattered. He made mental notes. But after 40 minutes of genuine discussion, Caldwell rose to speak. He was smooth. That was the word for it. Everything about the man was smooth, polished, designed to present itself as reasonable. He spoke about the importance of the community, maintaining clarity about property rights and land stewardship. He spoke about the responsibility that came with ownership. He used the word legitimate 3 times in 4 sentences, and then he said, without quite saying it, that the Whitaker ranch presented an unusual situation: a long-absent owner, a non-family caretaker, operating without formal authority. Questions about whether the decisions made on behalf of the property during the years of absence had been in the best interest of the property itself. He didn't name Margaret. He didn't have to. Every person in the room knew who he was talking about. Caleb felt the shift in the room, the way people who had been listening neutrally began looking sideways at each other, recalibrating. It was subtle, and it was effective, and it made something hot and precise rise in his chest. He stood up. The room went quiet. "Mr. Caldwell," Caleb said. His voice was even, completely even. "I'd like to respond to what you just said if the room will permit it." Fletcher looked uncertain. Caldwell's expression was carefully neutral. "Go ahead, Mr. Whitaker," Fletcher said. Caleb looked at Caldwell first. Then he turned and looked at the room, at the faces of the people who had been his father's neighbors, the people who had watched this valley for decades, who had their own memories of Thomas Whitaker and their own ideas about what his son's return meant. "I was gone for 7 years," Caleb said. I'm not going to stand here and tell you I wasn't or explain it away. I made a choice when I was young and stubborn and too proud to admit I was wrong, and I lived with the consequences of it for a long time." He paused. "But I want to be very clear about something. During every one of those 7 years, there was a person at the Whitaker ranch doing work that I had abandoned. Managing the land, caring for my father, keeping faith with a promise she made to a dying man, not because anyone was watching or paying her adequately or giving her any credit for it, but because she said she would." He kept his voice steady. "That person is Margaret Hayes, and the suggestion that her presence at that ranch, her years of labor, her sacrifices, her integrity, represents anything other than extraordinary loyalty is a suggestion I will not let stand in any room I am standing in." He heard the shift in the room. Not applause, this wasn't that kind of moment. But an adjustment, a collective recalibration, the sound of a large group of people quietly changing their minds. Caldwell's face was still pleasant, but the pleasantness had gone rigid. "No one is questioning Mrs. Hayes's character," Caldwell said. "You were doing a passable impression of it," Caleb said. "And I think most people in this room are intelligent enough to have noticed that." A sound moved through the crowd. Not a laugh exactly, something more complicated. Caldwell changed tactics. He set down the personal angle and went back to the legal one. The question of formal documentation of proper title of procedural clarity. It was the version of the argument that was harder to fight emotionally because it had the texture of reasonableness. And Caleb had prepared for it. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded set of documents. He had spent the previous week working with Harlan Cole by correspondence, and Cole had moved quickly. The documents were a formal legal affirmation of the Whitaker title with a supplemental statement, clarifying the arrangement with Margaret, her role, her authority during the years of absence, the legitimacy of every decision she had made on behalf of the property. He walked to the front of the room and handed the documents to Fletcher. "These are properly filed and attested," Caleb said. "The ranch belongs to me. Every decision made in my absence was made with my father's explicit authority and is fully defensible. There are no legal questions outstanding about the Whitaker ranch that have not been answered." He looked at Caldwell directly. "Is there anything else you'd like to address?" Caldwell looked at the documents in Fletcher's hands. The pleasantness in his face had thinned to something barely distinguishable from its absence. "No," he said. "I think that covers it." He sat down. Caleb went back to his seat. Margaret was very still beside him. She was looking at the front of the room, not at him. But under the table, out of sight of the people around them, she pressed the back of her hand briefly against his. A small private thing, a gesture so contained it would have been invisible to anyone watching. He felt it all the way through him. The meeting continued for another half hour, moving back to the genuine business of the water rights. Caleb participated, offered what he knew about the tributary that ran through the northern edge of his land, and listened to what others knew. When it was over, and people began filing out, several of his neighbors stopped to speak with him. Holt Devereaux, a woman named Parsons, who had run her own ranch since her husband died, and who shook both his hand and Margaret's with a grip that said more than words. Caldwell left without speaking to either of them. His 2 men followed him out. The door closed. Holt appeared at Caleb's elbow. "You did well," he said. "Your father taught you something after all." "He taught me everything that matters," Caleb said. "I just took too long to use it." Holt nodded once and walked out into the evening. Outside, the air had cooled, and the town's main street stretched out in the early dark lantern light falling in yellow pools across the packed earth. They walked to the wagon in silence. Caleb climbed up one side and Margaret climbed up the other, and he waited until she was settled before he picked up the reins. "You prepared those documents ahead of time," she said. "Last week," he said. "I had a feeling." "You didn't tell me." "I didn't want you to worry about it before you needed to." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Don't do that again." He looked at her. "Don't manage what I know to protect me from worry," she said. "I'm your partner. That means I carry things with you, not after you've already handled them." He held her gaze for a moment. "You're right," he said. "I'm sorry." She held his gaze a beat longer, making sure the apology had landed. Then she turned to face the road. "You did well in there," she said. "What you said. About," she paused, "about me." "I meant it," Caleb said. "I know," she said. "That's why it—" She stopped herself. "Why it what?" She shook her head slightly. Not dismissal, more like a woman deciding consciously that a feeling was not yet ready to be spoken. He understood that. He had the same thing happening in his own chest, and he wasn't ready to speak it either. He turned the wagon toward the ranch, and they rode in comfortable silence through the dark. It was 2 days later that the hardest thing happened. Caleb was in the barn, working on a cracked harness, with the focused attention of a man who had learned that small repairs ignored became large failures when he heard a horse on the road. He came out of the barn and saw a rider. He didn't know, a young man, maybe 20, leading a second horse behind him and holding a letter. "Looking for Caleb Whitaker," the young man said. "That's me." The letter was from a man named Carson Briggs, a former associate of his from the mining camps. One of the few people from those years he'd maintained any contact with. Carson was not a letter writer by nature, which meant the letter had a reason. He read it standing in the yard. Carson wrote that he had stayed on in the territory after Caleb left, working a claim they had briefly shared, and that the claim had finally produced. Not enormous. Not the fortune they'd imagined at 20, but real. Substantial. Enough to change a man's situation significantly. Carson had remembered that Caleb had contributed equipment and supplies to the claim in its early months, and he was writing to say that Caleb's share, by his reckoning, was owed to him. The number at the bottom of the letter was more than Caleb had earned in all 7 years combined. He stood in the yard for a long time holding the letter. 7 years. He had spent 7 years in those camps and come home with nothing. And then, 3 months after he stopped looking, the thing he had been looking for had come to find him. He almost laughed. It was either laugh or do something else entirely, and he didn't want to scare the horse. He folded the letter and put it in his coat pocket and went to find Margaret. She was in the kitchen making notes in the ledger. She looked up when he came in. Something in his face made her put down her pencil. "Sit down," he said. "That's never a reassuring way to start. Sit down anyway." She sat. He put the letter on the table in front of her. She read it. He watched her face as she read it, the careful stillness, the slight movement of her eyes down the page, the pause when she reached the number at the bottom. She looked up at him. "This is real," she said. "Carson, a straight dealer," Caleb said. "If he says the number's right, it's right." Margaret looked at the letter again. 7 years, she said quietly. "I know. You came home empty-handed and then—" "I know," he said again. She set the letter down. She pressed her palms flat on the table. He could see her processing it, not the money itself, but what it meant, the layers beneath the surface number. "What are you going to do with it?" she said. He had thought about this for the 20 minutes it had taken him to find her. "Clear the remaining debt," he said. "Properly this time. I want it done, and I want it documented. Repair the barn roof before winter. I've been watching that north section, and it won't hold another hard snow. Build up the herd. And—" he stopped. "And," she said. "And I want to build a proper house," he said. "The farmhouse is sound, but it's small. If this ranch is going to grow, and if—" he stopped again. "If the future looks the way I'm starting to think it might look, we need more space." Margaret looked at him across the table. "If the future looks the way you're starting to think it might look," she repeated slowly. "Yes. That's a careful way of saying something." "I'm trying to be careful," he said, "because I don't want to get it wrong." She held his gaze. Something had shifted in the room, a change in the pressure of the air, the way it changes before weather moves in, when everything gets very still and very clear. "Then say it uncarefully," Margaret said. Her voice was even, but it was the evenness of someone who is holding something tightly and has decided consciously to let go of it. Caleb looked at her. "I am in love with you," he said. I've been in love with you, I think, since somewhere around the third morning when you came into the barn at 5 in the morning with a lantern and looked at me like you were surprised I'd actually gotten up on time, and something in your face changed just for a second, and I thought, that's the person I want to spend the rest of my life trying to earn. He kept his eyes on her face. I know I don't deserve you. I know that's a thing you're probably very aware of. I know you're not a woman who makes decisions based on how a man feels about her. You make decisions based on what's true and what's right and what's been earned. So I'm not asking you to do anything about it tonight. I'm just telling you because you told me not to manage what you know, and this is something you should know. The kitchen was very quiet. Margaret sat with her hands flat on the table and her eyes on his face, and she did not look away, and she did not speak for what felt like a very long time. You know what your father said to me, she said finally, the last time I sat with him, the last night. No, Caleb said. He said. Her voice tightened just slightly the way it did when she was controlling something real. Margaret, when my boy comes home, don't be too hard on him. He's going to walk through that door with nothing and think he has nothing to offer. But that boy has more inside him than he knows. He just hasn't had any reason to dig for it yet. She paused. He said, give him a reason. Caleb couldn't speak. I thought he was talking about the ranch, Margaret said quietly. I thought he meant give him a reason to work, a reason to stay, a reason to stop running. She looked at the table. I don't think he was only talking about the ranch. Margaret, Caleb said. I'm not ready, she said. I want you to understand that. Not because I don't. She stopped, chose her words. Not because what you said isn't something I've thought about, but because I spent a long time building something inside myself that was only mine after losing everything else. A life that didn't depend on whether another person stayed or left. And before I give any part of that to anyone, I need to know it's real. Gratitude, not loneliness. Not the particular feeling that happens between two people when they've been through hard things together. Real. How do I prove that? Caleb said. You're already doing it, she said. Just keep going. He nodded. One nod, slow accepting. Then I'll keep going, he said. She held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she picked up her pencil and looked at the letter on the table. First thing, she said in her practical voice, the one she used when she was putting something behind a closed door. For now, you write to Carson Briggs and confirm the arrangement. Then you talk to Cole about the documentation on the remaining debt. Then we look at the barn roof before the weather turns. In that order, Caleb said. In that order, she said. The feelings can wait a day. The barn roof cannot. He almost smiled. The almost smile was something she caught, and something moved across her face in response. Not quite a smile herself, but the shape of one, the suggestion. It was enough. He went to find paper and ink, and the letter to Carson Briggs was the first thing he wrote, and the ranch moved through the rest of that day, the way it always did, with the indifferent regularity of a living thing that needed tending, regardless of the weather, in the hearts of the people tending it. But that night after supper, when Margaret had gone to her room and the farmhouse had gone quiet, Caleb sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a long time. He sat in the same chair he had sat in on his first night back, exhausted and ashamed, watching his hands and thinking about everything he had destroyed by leaving. He looked at his hands now. They were still rough, still scarred, still the hands of a man who had worked hard and made bad choices and come back with less than he left with. But they were different too. Not in the physical sense, in something beneath the physical, something in the way they rested on the table. They were the hands of a man who had something to build toward, who had a reason to get up in the morning that had nothing to do with gold or money or proving himself to people who didn't matter. He thought about what Margaret had said his father told her. He just hasn't had any reason to dig for it yet. His father had known. Of course his father had known. Thomas Whitaker, who had watched the road every spring and kept faith in a son who gave him no reason to. Thomas had known that what his son needed wasn't punishment or lessons or judgment. He needed a reason. He had sent Margaret Hayes, not intentionally, not exactly. But he had asked her to stay, and in asking her to stay, he had placed in this house the one thing that could reach past Caleb's failures and his pride and his long record of choosing wrong. The example of a person who chose right consistently, without applause, without reward, because she had decided it was the person she wanted to be. Caleb pressed both hands flat on the table and felt the solidity of it. The old wood his father had set his hands on for 40 years. He was not going anywhere. He was not going to run out of road again. Tomorrow, the barn roof needed attention, and the letter to Carson needed writing, and the ledger needed updating, and the cattle needed feeding, and Margaret would be up before the sun, and she would expect him to be up too, and he would be. He would be up before the sun for the rest of his life, if that was what it took. He pushed back from the table and went to bed. Outside, the valley held its silence wide and dark and patient, as the land itself and the ranch kept its quiet vigil under the stars, the way it had kept vigil for months before he came home, waiting, holding, refusing to give up on the people who belonged to it. Just the way his father had taught it to. The money from Carson Briggs arrived 6 weeks later, carried by a bank draft that Harlan Cole helped Caleb process through the bank in Billings. The day it cleared, Caleb paid off the remaining debt in full, walked out of the bank, stood in the street for a moment, and breathed in a way he hadn't breathed since he came home. Clean. That was the word for it. For the first time in months, the ranch was clean. No debt hanging over it, no Birch breathing down the back of their necks, no Caldwell looking for the pressure point that would make them crack. The land was theirs. Fully, legally, unambiguously theirs. He rode home and told Margaret. She was in the garden when he came through the gate, kneeling in the turned earth, the way she did most mornings, moving with the unhurried efficiency of someone who understood that food didn't grow faster because you rushed at it. She looked up when she heard his horse. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her. She read it in his face. She stood up, brushed the dirt from her hands against her apron, and said, "It's done." "It's done," he said. She pressed her lips together, nodded once, and then she turned back to the garden and crouched down and kept working, because the beans didn't know the debt was paid and didn't care, and that was Margaret Hayes. In a single moment, she felt it deeply, and then she kept going. Caleb tied his horse and went to help her. They worked side by side in the garden for an hour without talking much, and it was the best hour he'd had in months. That evening, Holt came by with his wife Clara, and a bottle of something that was technically whiskey and practically more of an aspiration, and they sat on the porch, and Holt raised his cup and said, "To Thomas Whitaker, who knew what he was doing, even when nobody else could see it." They all drank. Clara, who was a small, direct woman with sharp eyes and a warm mouth, looked at Margaret across the porch railing and said, "You held this place together for 3 years." "The place held itself," Margaret said. "I just showed up." Clara shook her head. "No, don't do that. Don't make it smaller than it was." She held Margaret's gaze. "We saw it. We all saw it, even the ones who didn't say so." Margaret said nothing, but something moved in her face, something careful and private, and she looked at her cup and didn't argue. Caleb noticed. He always noticed now, after Holt and Clara left. After the evening had settled and the ranch gone quiet, Margaret stood at the porch railing, looking out at the dark. Caleb sat in the chair his father had always sat in and watched the same dark and did not rush her toward conversation. After a while she said, "Clara's a good woman." "She is," Caleb said. "She said something to me earlier while you and Holt were talking. She said—" Margaret paused. "She said your father told her the last winter he was alive that the proudest thing he ever did was leave this land to a person who would love it like he did." Caleb looked at her back. "He was talking about you," Caleb said. "I know," Margaret said. "That's what got me." She was quiet again. He let the quiet be what it was. "He never met me," she said finally. "He asked for help, and I came and we worked together for 2 years, and somewhere in that time he decided I was worth saying something like that about." She turned to look at Caleb. "How does a person know something like that about someone? After just 2 years? Some people," Caleb said carefully, "know things about other people that those people don't know about themselves." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. "Your father was like that," she said. "So are you," Caleb said. She turned back to the railing. He heard the soft exhale of a woman deciding not to respond to something she didn't yet have the words for. He didn't push. He had learned not to push. The barn roof went up in the first 2 weeks of October, with help from Holt's oldest boy and a young man named Ellis, who had come west looking for work and had found it on the Whitaker ranch. Ellis was 22, lanky, earnest to a fault, and deeply willing to learn, which were qualities Caleb recognized and valued, because they were the qualities he was still trying to build in himself. Watching Caleb teach Ellis. The things Margaret had taught him was a strange loop of a thing. The knowledge moving from her hands to his, and now from his hands to someone else's. The ranch generating its own small lineage of craft and competence. Margaret watched it too from a distance. He caught her watching once, and she looked away quickly, which was so unlike her usual directness that it lodged in his mind and stayed there. That evening, he asked her about it. "You were watching me with Ellis," he said. "I was watching both of you," she corrected. "What were you thinking?" She considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything, without rushing to fill the silence with something convenient. "I was thinking," she said, "that you're different than you were when you got here." "Different how?" She looked at him. "You're not trying to prove anything anymore," she said. "In the beginning, those first weeks, everything you did had this quality of," she searched for the word, demonstration. "Like you were doing the work, but also watching yourself do it. Making sure I could see it." She tilted her head slightly. "You're not doing that anymore. You're just doing the work." He thought about that. "Is that good?" he said. "It's real," she said. "Real is always better than good." He held her gaze for a moment. "Margaret," he said. "Don't," she said. "I wasn't going to say anything dramatic." "You had a dramatic look on your face." "I was just going to say thank you." She looked at him steadily. "For what?" "For noticing," he said. "The difference. Most people don't notice things like that. You notice everything." Something moved across her face. The armor was there as always, but the edges of it were softer now than they had been in September. He could see the difference. He chose not to point it out. The twist arrived on a Wednesday in mid-October, and it came from the last direction Caleb had been watching. He had been so focused on Caldwell, on the external threat, the man on the gray horse with the polished boots and the patient smile, that he had not sufficiently considered the threat that could come from inside his own history. Her name was Vivian Alcott, and she was the daughter of a wealthy merchant from Helena who had known the Whitaker family when Caleb was young. She arrived in town with her father on business, and she sought Caleb out deliberately, and she was beautiful in the particular way of women who have been told so often that they are beautiful, that they have constructed their entire personality around the management of its effect on people. She found him at the general store. "Caleb Whitaker," she said, and her voice had the warm, practiced quality of someone who had rehearsed the tone of this encounter. He turned. It took him a moment. "Vivian Alcott," he said. "Vivian Alcott Hargrove," she said. "I married 2 years ago. He died last spring." She said it without visible grief, which told him more than the words did. "I'm sorry to hear it," he said, because it was the polite thing, and he wasn't yet sure what kind of conversation this was. "Are you?" she said. And there was something in the way she said it, a particular brightness, a forward lean of the energy in her voice, that told him exactly what kind of conversation this was. He stepped back. Physically. One step. Establishing a distance. "It's good to see you," he said. "I hope your business in town goes well." "I was hoping to call on you at the ranch," she said. "My father has some business he'd like to discuss, land-related. I thought perhaps I could come along." "I don't think that's necessary," Caleb said. "If your father has business questions, he can write to me." Her smile didn't waver. It was the smile of a woman who was accustomed to obstacles evaporating. "You've become very serious," she said. "I remember you differently." "I was young," Caleb said. "I'm different now." He tipped his hat. He walked out of the store. He told Margaret that evening. He didn't have to. No one would have known if he hadn't. But he had made a promise to himself after her rebuke about the Birch documents that he would not manage what she knew. That partnership meant she carried things with him, not after. So he sat down at the kitchen table and told her all of it. Vivian's name, her appearance. What she said, the way she said it, the step back, he took the way he handled it. Margaret listened without expression. When he finished, she was quiet. "You told me because you said you wouldn't manage what I know," she said. "Yes. Not because you felt guilty." "I have nothing to feel guilty about," he said. "I told you because you deserve to know things that affect this house." Margaret looked at the table. Her jaw was tight. Not at him, he thought, at something internal, something she was working through. "She'll come here anyway," Margaret said. "Women like that don't take the first no." "Probably," Caleb said. "And when she does, she'll be everything I'm not," Margaret said. It was stated flatly, without self-pity, the way she stated uncomfortable facts. Thin, well-dressed, from money. Exactly the kind of woman people in this town expect a Whitaker to end up with. "Margaret, I'm not done," she said. "I'm not saying it to feel sorry for myself. I'm saying it because I want to be honest with you about what I know about the world. And the world is going to look at her standing next to you, and it's going to look at me, and the math it does is not going to favor me." "I don't care what the world's math says," Caleb said. "I know you believe that," she said. "Right now in this kitchen, you believe it completely." She looked up at him. "But you're a man who spent 7 years caring deeply what the world thought of him. That doesn't disappear because you've had a good few months." The words landed hard. Not because they were cruel, they weren't. Because they were accurate. And she knew him well enough now to know exactly where the accurate words would land. He sat with it. "You're right that I spent 7 years caring what the world thought," he said. "And you're right that it doesn't disappear overnight." He met her eyes. "But I've also spent the last 4 months watching a woman who has never once made a decision based on what the world told her she was worth. And that changes a man. More than anything else I've experienced in my life, watching you has changed me." He held her gaze. "She could walk through that door tomorrow, and I would send her home. Not for appearances. Not because I'm trying to prove something. Because she is not the person I want to be building this life with." Margaret looked at him for a long time. The kitchen held its breath. "All right," she said quietly. "All right," he said. "All right," she said again. And something in the way she said it this time was different from every other time she'd said it. Softer, less armored. The door, not just unlocked, but open. He didn't say anything more. He had learned that with Margaret, the moment a thing was said that mattered, the worst thing you could do was pile more words on top of it. Vivian came on Friday. She arrived in a buggy with her father, who was a perfectly decent man named Gerald Alcott, who had genuine questions about a land purchase, and who Caleb suspected had not entirely understood what his daughter intended to make of the visit. Gerald was direct, businesslike, and they finished his actual questions in 20 minutes. Vivian spent those 20 minutes looking at the farmhouse, the yard, the garden, and Margaret, who was working near the barn, and who had not come forward to be introduced, a choice that Caleb understood was deliberate and respected. After Gerald and Caleb had concluded their business, Vivian said with the studied casualness of a woman who had planned the question, "Your arrangement here is unusual, isn't it? A woman running the property with you." "She's my partner," Caleb said. "In the ranch. She knows this land better than anyone alive, and her judgment in running it has been the primary reason it's still standing." Vivian smiled. "Of course. Very practical." "It is," Caleb said. "And it's a great deal more than practical. But you don't need to understand it, Miss Alcott. You just need to know that it's not a subject open for commentary." Gerald Alcott, who had been looking at the middle distance, cleared his throat. "We should be getting back to town," he said. Vivian's smile stayed in place, but something behind it went cold. "It was good to see you, Caleb," she said. "Safe travels," he said. He watched the buggy go. Then he walked to the barn. Margaret was inside checking the tack. She didn't look up when he came in. "Gone," she said. "Gone," he said. She nodded. Kept working. "You heard," he said. "Enough," she said. She paused over a piece of harness, fingers checking a worn section of leather. "You called me your partner." "You are my partner." "In front of her," Margaret said. "In front of a woman who came here to..." She stopped. Yes, Caleb said. In front of her. Margaret set down the harness. She stood with her back to him for a moment. When she turned around, her face had something on it that he had not seen there before. Not the armor, not the steadiness, not the carefully contained emotion. Something more open than any of those. Something that looked, if he was reading it right, like a woman standing at the edge of something she had been circling for a long time. Caleb, she said. Yes, he said. I need to ask you something and I need you to answer it honestly. Always, he said. Are you in love with me, she said, or are you in love with what I represent, the ranch? Your father's memory. The idea of becoming a good man. Because sometimes those things look the same from the inside, and I need to know you can tell the difference. The question was the most Margaret Hayes thing she had ever said to him. Blunt, brave, and exactly right. I thought about it honestly. He did not rush to answer. He let the question sit in the air between them, and he looked at it from every side he could find. I love what this ranch means, he said. I love the chance to become someone my father would recognize. Those things are real, but they're not what I feel when I walk in from the field, and you're at that table with a ledger book frowning at a number that doesn't add up, and you look up and there's 2 seconds before you put the face back on, and in those 2 seconds you're just... He stopped. Tried again. You're just yourself. Not the woman who survived losing her farm. Not the woman who kept my father's ranch alive. Not the woman who fought Caldwell. Just you. And those 2 seconds are the reason I get up in the morning. He held her gaze. That's not the ranch. That's you. Margaret looked at him. And for the first time since he had come home, the armor came all the way down. Not dramatically. There was no sweeping movement, no rush across the space between them. She just looked at him fully, without the careful maintenance of distance she had held for 4 months, and what he saw in her face was something he had not dared to hope for. Not gratitude, not respect, not the measured warmth of a woman who appreciated him. She walked to him. She stopped a foot away. She looked up at him and said, I have been in love with you since the day you stood in that church hall and told a room full of people who I was. He put his hand against her face. Her cheek was warm from the barn air, and she turned into the touch just slightly, the way a person leans toward something they've been cold without for a long time. I'm sorry it took me so long, he said. You were running out of wrong roads, she said. Your father told me to be patient. He left, and the laugh came from somewhere real and unguarded. The laugh of a man who has finally put down something very heavy and feels the absence of the weight. He was a wise man, Caleb said. The wisest, Margaret agreed. She stepped back, not away, just to where she could look at him properly, and the look on her face was one he intended to spend the rest of his life earning. Now, she said, and the practical voice was back, but it was warm now, warm all the way through. The North cattle need moving before the temperature drops tonight, and Ellis needs supervision, or he'll put them in the wrong pasture, and supper isn't going to make itself. Margaret, Caleb said. What? In a moment, he said. Just in a moment. She looked at him. The warmth in her face didn't move. In a moment, she agreed. They stood in the barn in the fading afternoon, and the cattle moved in the pasture beyond, and the ranch held itself steady around them. The way it had held itself steady through everything. Through the years of absence, through the loneliness, through the debt and the threats and the slow hard work of becoming something worth saving. The land had waited. The land was patient. It had learned that from Thomas Whitaker, who had waited every spring for his son to come down the road, and it had learned it from Margaret Hayes, who had shown up every single morning for 3 years with no guarantee of anything except her own promise. And now Caleb Whitaker stood in the barn of his father's ranch with the woman who had saved it, and the future arranged itself in front of him like a road he had not yet traveled, but could finally for the first time see. It was not the road he had imagined at 23 when he left. It was not gold or glory, or the particular kind of success that proved things to people who didn't matter. It was narrower than that road and more real, and it required showing up every day without glamour or reward, and it led somewhere that the wider road for all its promise had never led. It led home. He didn't need any more time to understand that. He picked up his coat from the hook on the barn wall and walked out to help Ellis with the cattle, and Margaret walked beside him, and the evening came in over the valley, the way evenings came, steady, golden, unimpressed by human drama, concerned only with the turning of the day toward rest. And for the first time in a very long time, Caleb Whitaker rested inside himself as he walked. The hard part, he knew, was not finished. There would be more winters, more problems he hadn't anticipated, more moments when the right thing was hard and the wrong thing was easy, and the difference mattered more than he wanted it to. There would be days when the gap between who he had been and who he was trying to become felt too wide to cross. But Margaret would be there. She had been there through worse for less reason, and his father's land would be there, patient, steady, asking nothing more than that the people who worked it show up the next morning and the morning after that. He could do that. He was already doing it. Ellis was in the north pasture holding his hat in the wind and looking uncertain about the cattle, and Caleb came up beside him and put a hand on the young man's shoulder and said, "Here's what we're going to do," and showed him. That was all. That was everything. The winter came in hard that year, not the kind of hard that apologizes for itself, with a few warm days in the middle, the genuine Montana kind, the sort that arrived in November and made itself at home with the confidence of something that knew it was going to be there for a long time. The temperature dropped below zero in the second week of the month and didn't come back up in any meaningful way until March. The snowfall was consistent and heavy, and the wind that came across the open valley had an edge to it that cut through layers like they weren't there. Caleb had survived worse winters in the mining camps, but surviving a winter in a canvas tent with 4 other miserable men was a different kind of survival than protecting a herd of cattle and a ranch and another person through the same cold. This winter, he had something worth protecting. That changed everything about how he moved through it. How was up before 4 most mornings, because the animals needed feeding before the temperature dropped to its daily worst, and because Ellis, for all his willingness, still needed direction in the pre-dawn dark when everything was frozen and difficult, and the margin for a wrong decision was narrow. Caleb moved through those mornings with a focused quiet that he had never managed in his mining camp years, the same physical work, the same cold, but entirely different inside, because the work now had a shape that made sense to him. He knew what it was for. He could see what it was building. Margaret was always awake before him. Every single morning, without exception, he would come into the kitchen and find her already at the stove, already moving, already 3 steps ahead of whatever the day required. The first time it happened, he stopped in the doorway and said, "Do you ever actually sleep?" She handed him a cup of coffee without looking up from what she was doing and said, "Sleep is for people who don't have cattle." He drank the coffee and went to work and thought about how his father must have stood in that same doorway on mornings like this and felt the same particular kind of gratitude that doesn't have a clean word to describe it. The gratitude of a person who has been given something they didn't deserve and knows it and intends to be worthy of it anyway. They had not spoken again directly about what had been said in the barn. Not because either of them was avoiding it more, because it had been said and landed and didn't need to be repeated. It lived in the daily life of the ranch, the way important things live in daily life, in the way he watched for her without meaning to, in the way she sometimes turned from what she was doing to look at him for a moment longer than the task required, in the small adjustments they made to each other's presence that neither of them named, but both of them felt. It was enough. For now, it was enough. The first test of the winter came in December, when one of the older cows, a broad roan, they had privately named Ethel because she had the temperament of a tired schoolteacher, became sick with a respiratory illness that spread fast through animals living in close proximity during cold snaps. Caleb recognized the symptoms 2 mornings in because Margaret had taught him what to watch for, and he went to her immediately. She was in the barn within 4 minutes of him telling her. She worked for 6 hours that day, moving between animals, checking temperatures, isolating the 2 cows who showed the worst symptoms, making decisions with a speed and confidence that Caleb tried to keep up with and mostly managed. Ellis watched from a careful distance with the expression of a man who is learning more in 1 day than he had in a month. By evening, they had contained it. Lost none of the herd. Caleb sat down on a hay bale after the last animal was settled and let out a breath that had been compressed for about 10 hours. Margaret sat down beside him. You knew what to look for, she said. That's why we caught it early. You taught me what to look for, he said. Then we did it together, she said in the tone she used when she was closing an argument, by finding the version of events that was fair to both sides. He looked at her profile in the barn light, the steadiness of her, the particular quality of her tiredness, which was the tiredness of someone who had expended everything on something that mattered and had no regret about the expenditure. Margaret, he said. Caleb, she said. I want to ask you something. She turned to look at him. The wariness was not back. It was something more careful than wariness. Attention. Full attention. I've been thinking about the spring, he said. About what the ranch is going to look like by spring. We're going to come out of this winter in better shape than we went in. The herd is healthy mostly. The finances are stable. The barn roof held. Cole says the title is airtight. He paused. I've been thinking about what comes next. What I want to build. And, she said. He looked at his hands. I'd like to build it with you, he said. Not as partners. Not as whatever we've been calling it. I'd like to marry you, Margaret, if you're willing. And I am asking you now in a barn that smells like hay and sick cow, because I don't want to wait for a better moment, and because I think you'd be suspicious of anything that looked too arranged. She was quiet. He waited. He was good at waiting now. He had learned it from her. Caleb Whitaker, she said. Yes, ma'am. You are asking me to marry you in a barn. I am. Wearing a coat that has manure on the left sleeve. He looked at the coat. She was not wrong. I am, he said again. Margaret looked at the hay-strewn floor of the barn. Her mouth did the thing it did when she was trying not to smile and losing the fight. Your father, she said, proposed to your mother in a barn. Did you know that? He stared at her. How do you know that? He told me, she said. One evening in his last winter, he said. Her voice softened slightly. I asked her in the old north barn, and she said yes before I got the whole sentence out, and I always figured it was the barn that clinched it. Women who love ranches love barns. Caleb was still for a moment. Do you love barns? He said. Margaret looked at him. Yes, she said. I'll marry you. He let out a breath. Before I get the whole sentence out, he said. You got the whole sentence out, she said. I just didn't see any reason to make you wait through the silence. He reached over and took her hand, which was rough from work and cold from the evening air, and she let him hold it, and they sat side by side on the hay bale in the barn, with the cattle quiet around them, and the wind moving against the walls outside, and it was the most at peace Caleb Whitaker had felt since before he could remember feeling at peace at all. They told no one for 2 days because they needed those 2 days to themselves to sit with the reality of it in the quiet of the farmhouse and the work of the ranch before it became a public thing that other people had opinions about. Caleb understood without Margaret having to explain it that she needed to inhabit the decision privately before she wore it in front of the world. She had spent too many years having her choices questioned by people with less than half her sense to want to hand them this one before she was ready. On the 3rd day, she told Clara Holt. He knew because he came in from the morning work and found Clara at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a look on her face that was equal parts happiness and the particular triumph of a woman who had been quietly hoping for exactly this outcome for longer than anyone had asked her to. Clara looked at Caleb and said, It's about time. I reckon, he said. Holt came that evening and shook Caleb's hand and then shook it again and said, Thomas would have, and then stopped because he was a man of few words, and the ones that came to mind were more than he knew how to deliver without his voice doing something embarrassing. I know, Caleb said. I know. News in a small valley traveled the way it always traveled, and by the following week, people knew. The reactions were mostly what Caleb had expected. Some genuine warmth, some politely veiled surprise from the people who had imagined a different future for him, and a small handful of people who smiled to his face and said something different behind his back. But something had shifted in the valley's relationship with Margaret Hayes. It had been shifting since the church hall meeting slowly and unevenly, the way collective opinion always shifts, not all at once, not with fanfare, but through the gradual accumulation of evidence that the story a community had told itself about a person was not accurate. People had watched her manage the ranch. They had watched her face down Caldwell. They had watched her work through conditions that would have broken most men, and they had run out of ways to make it small. Mrs. Parsons, who ran her own spread, and whose endorsement carried genuine weight in the valley, made a point of stopping Margaret on the road into town and saying loud enough for the two women behind her to hear, "I'm glad he had the sense to know what he had. Not all men do." Margaret thanked her. She told Caleb about it that evening, with the measured tone she used when something had affected her more than she wanted to show. "She meant it," Caleb said. "I know," Margaret said. "That's what got me." Then came Caldwell. It was January deep winter, the kind of cold that made outdoor work punishing and indoor work necessary. And Caleb had been in the house working through financial records with the focus of a man who had learned finally that understanding numbers was not optional if you wanted to keep what you'd built. The letter arrived with the morning mail, and Margaret brought it in with the rest without comment, because she had learned to read return addresses, and this one she recognized. Caldwell's lawyers based in Helena. Caleb read it. Then he set it down and said quietly, and with great precision, a word that he would not have used in mixed company. "What is it?" Margaret said. He handed her the letter. She read it. The color in her face didn't change. She was too controlled for that, but her jaw tightened in a way he had learned to read as the equivalent of a lesser person throwing something. The letter was elegant in its ruthlessness. Caldwell's lawyers had identified a technicality not in the title itself, which Cole had made airtight, but in a water rights agreement that Thomas Whitaker had signed decades earlier. The agreement gave a neighboring property specific rights to the tributary that ran through the north edge of the Whitaker land. The neighboring property had since been purchased by one of Caldwell's holding companies, and Caldwell's lawyers were now arguing that the language of the original agreement properly interpreted gave them the right to redirect that tributary, which would leave the north pasture without reliable water access, effectively making that portion of the land unworkable. "He can't do this," Caleb said. "He's doing it," Margaret said. Cole said the title was airtight. "The title is," she said. "This isn't about the title." She set the letter on the table. "This is about the water." Caleb looked at the letter, the elegant, reasonable, devastatingly precise language of it. "He's been waiting all winter," Caleb said. "He had lawyers working on this while we were fixing the barn roof," Margaret said. "While we were worried about the sick cow. She stopped. "While we were getting engaged," Caleb said. "Yes," she said. He stood up. He could not sit still with this. "He's not going to get the water," he said. "How are you going to stop him?" she said. Not challenging, asking. Direct and practical, because that was what the situation required. "I'm going to call Cole," he said. "Today. I'm going to find out everything there is to know about that original agreement, and about what Caldwell's company actually purchased, and what rights actually transferred. And then I'm going to find the thing in that agreement that Caldwell thinks he's standing on, and I'm going to find the crack in it." Margaret looked at him. "And if there's no crack," she said. "There's always a crack," Caleb said. "Men like Caldwell build their arguments on speed and intimidation. They count on the other person being too scared or too poor to look closely. We're neither." He wrote to Cole that afternoon. Cole wrote back in 10 days, which felt like an eternity, but which Caleb had learned was actually fast for a careful lawyer, with a response that was long and detailed, and at its core promising. The original water rights agreement, Cole explained, had been written with language that was specific to the agricultural use of the property that had originally owned the neighboring land. Caldwell's holding company had purchased that property but had converted most of it to speculative purposes. It was not being actively farmed. Cole's argument was that the water rights agreement had been written to govern agricultural use, that the original intent was agricultural, and that a non-agricultural holding company could not claim the full benefit of an agreement that had been written for farming purposes. It was not a guaranteed argument. Cole was careful to say that, but it was a real one. The second thing Cole had found was more interesting. The original agreement had been signed by both Thomas Whitaker and the previous owner of the neighboring property, a man named Garrett. When Caldwell's company purchased the Garrett property, they had purchased it through a chain of title that involved 3 intermediary transfers over 15 years. Cole had traced each transfer carefully. In the third transfer, a sale that had happened in 1869, the water rights agreement had not been explicitly referenced in the transfer documents. It was possible, Cole said, to argue that the agreement had not cleanly transferred with the land. Caleb read that section of Cole's letter twice. Then he took it to Margaret. She read it at the kitchen table with the same precision she brought to the ledger books, and when she finished, she looked up and said, "He doesn't actually know if he has the rights." "Cole thinks he's been bluffing," Caleb said, "or close to it. He found a vulnerability, and he used it to create pressure betting we'd fold before we looked closely enough to find the gaps in his argument." "He doesn't know you very well," Margaret said. "He knew me well enough in September," Caleb said. "Empty-pocketed man who just came home, no knowledge of the land, no money. He had good reason to think he could outlast me." "What changed?" she said. He looked at her across the table. "You know what changed," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at Cole's letter. "Write back to Cole," she said. "Tell him to proceed with both arguments, and tell him we want this resolved before spring, before we need that pasture water." "Yes," Caleb said. The legal process that followed was not dramatic. Legal processes rarely were. It was correspondence and documentation and careful argument and counter-argument conducted across distances by men who communicated through letters and whose weapons were language and precedent. Caleb stayed out of Cole's way and let the man work, which was the hardest thing he had done in months, because patience under pressure was still not his strongest quality. Margaret was better at it than he was. She went about the daily work of the winter ranch as though the legal matter was simply one more thing on a list of things to be handled, present, acknowledged, and not permitted to consume everything else. He tried to match her. He mostly managed. In February, Caldwell's lawyers made a settlement offer. They offered to abandon the water rights claim entirely in exchange for a modest easement, a right of passage across the eastern edge of the Whitaker land, for access to a road that Caldwell's company wanted to use. Cole called it a capitulation dressed as compromise. Caleb took the offer to Margaret and read it to her word for word. She was quiet for a moment. "The easement," she said. "Is it through working land?" "Eastern edge," Caleb said. "It's the least productive section, rocky. We don't run cattle there." "Then it costs us nothing real," she said. "That's Cole's assessment too. And it ends the water question permanently." "Permanently and in writing," Caleb said. "Cole will make sure the language is airtight." Margaret looked out the window. The February light was thin and flat, and the valley lay under its deep cover of snow. "Take it," she said. "You're sure?" She turned to look at him. The goal was never to destroy Caldwell. The goal was to protect the ranch. If we can protect it and end this, we take it. She paused. "Besides, I'd like to go one full season without a lawyer." He took the offer. Cole finalized the documents by the first week of March. The water was theirs. The easement was a strip of rocky ground that they would barely notice. Caldwell's name was absent from the valley's active concerns for the first time since Caleb had come home. The morning Cole's confirmation letter arrived. Caleb walked to the place where his father was buried, the low hill at the eastern edge of the property where Thomas had asked to be laid when his time came, so he could, as he put it, keep an eye on things. He stood there in the early March cold, with the letter in his hand, and he talked to his father. Howe was not a man who talked to the dead as a rule. He wasn't sure he believed they could hear, but he stood there anyway, because there are things that need to be said even when you're not certain they can be received. And he said them. He told his father about the winter, about the sick cattle and the Caldwell letter and the legal argument Cole had built. He told him about Ellis, who had grown into the work in a way that made him genuinely useful and who had decided to stay on through the spring, which meant the ranch now had 3 people running it instead of 2, which changed what was possible. He told him about Margaret. He told him all of it. The barn in October, and what she said, and what he said. He told him about Clara Holt's face at the kitchen table. He told him about Mrs. Parsons on the road into town. He told him about the moment in the church hall when he stood up and the room went quiet, and he found somewhere inside himself the words his father would have used. He told him that the red door looked good, that whoever had chosen that color had understood something essential about what a house should communicate to the people coming home to it. He stood there for a long time. The wind moved across the valley, and the snow was softening at its edges with the first very early suggestion of spring. And the ranch lay below him. The repaired fences, the full pastures, the barn with its new roof, the farmhouse with its red door, Margaret's garden under its winter cover already waiting for April. "I know," he said aloud to the hill, to the grave, to the cold March air. "I know I wasted years. I know I cost you things I can't give back. I know you didn't deserve a son who left." He stopped. "But I'm here now, and I'm not leaving again." He looked at the grave marker his father had made for himself the year before he died, because Thomas Whitaker had been that kind of man, practical, unsentimental about mortality, determined to handle his own affairs. "She's everything," Caleb said. "I think you knew that before I did. I think you sent her here knowing exactly what she would become to me." He paused. "That sounds like you." The wind moved. He folded Cole's letter and put it in his coat pocket next to the place where he used to carry Holt's letter about his father's death. That pocket was empty. Now had been empty since the night he came home and burned the letter in the stove, not out of destruction, but out of completion. That chapter was finished. He did not need to carry it anymore. He walked back down the hill to the ranch. Margaret was in the garden when he came through the gate. Not working, it was too early for that, but standing at the edge of the winter-covered beds with her arms crossed, and the look she sometimes had when she was thinking forward, planning the spring. She glanced at him when he came through. She read his face. "The hill," she said. "Yes," he said. She nodded. She didn't ask what he had said. She understood that some conversations were private even when held aloud. "Cole's letter came," he said. "I know. I put it on the table. I took it with me," he said. "I wanted him to know." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at the garden. "He knew," she said quietly. The spring arrived, the way Montana springs always arrived, grudgingly in stages, the snow retreating by inches before a series of warm afternoons that kept getting interrupted by late cold snaps that made you feel briefly that winter had changed its mind. But it came. It always came. And when it came that year, it brought with it everything that winter's hard work had been building toward. The cattle that had come through the cold healthy went to market in the late spring at a price that made Holt raise his eyebrows and say something approximately complimentary. That was probably the most enthusiastic thing he had said since 1867. The north pasture with its secured water access opened up land they hadn't been able to rely on before and increased what the ranch could carry. Ellis had over the winter become competent enough that Caleb trusted him alone with the morning work 2 days a week, which gave him time for the planning and correspondence and financial management that a growing operation required. And the new house went up in June. It was not enormous. Margaret had been emphatic about that. She had no patience for scale for the sake of scale. And she said flatly that she would not live in a house that required more cleaning than it deserved. But it was solid. Built by Caleb's hands and Ellis's hands and the hands of 2 carpenters from town, who Caleb paid fairly and who worked fast. It had a kitchen large enough to work in properly, 2 bedrooms a room that Margaret immediately claimed for the ledger books and the running of the ranch's business, and a porch that faced east toward the hill. When the carpenters finished and left, Margaret walked through every room. Caleb followed her and said nothing, watching her face. She stopped in the kitchen. She ran one hand along the edge of the counter. "Your father would approve," she said. "Of the house. Of all of it," she said. The wedding was in July. They held it on the hill. Caleb's suggestion, which Margaret accepted without hesitation, understanding immediately what he meant by it. A small gathering. Holt and Clara Ellis Cole, who had made the trip from Billings for the occasion. Mrs. Parsons and her son, old Devereaux, and a handful of others who had earned their place in the circle of people the Whitakers trusted. The minister was a practical man named Aldous, who had known Thomas, and who, when he looked at Caleb and Margaret standing together on that hill, had the expression of a man completing a story he had been handed the beginning of some time ago. There were no elaborate speeches. Margaret had asked for none, and Caleb knew better than to argue with her about anything she had made up her mind about. The vows were the traditional ones, spoken plainly in the clear July air, with the valley spread below them, and the farmhouse and the new house visible in the distance, and Thomas Whitaker's grave marker 10 feet to their left, because Margaret had decided when they chose the spot that he should be part of it. He would have wanted to be here, she said. He is here, Caleb said. When the minister what needed to be said, and Caleb put the ring on Margaret's hand. A simple thing, silver, not elaborate, exactly right for her. She looked at it for a moment, and then looked up at him, and the look on her face was one he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Not the face she showed the world. Not the armor, and the steadiness, and the competent, unassailable Margaret Hayes, who ran a ranch and kept promises, and refused to be underestimated. The face underneath all of that. The one he had seen in pieces in 2-second moments over the course of months. The real one, the unguarded one. The one she only let exist when she had decided beyond doubt that she was safe. She was safe. I love you, he said. He had not said it plainly before, not exactly in those words. He had said everything around it and near it and underneath it, but not the direct thing. I know, she said. Then quietly in the way she said things, she meant most, I love you. Clara Holt from somewhere behind them made a sound that was unmistakably emotional and also unmistakably satisfying to hear. Margaret, without turning around, said, Clara. Sorry, Clara said. She was not sorry. The reception was on the new porch because it was where the most people could fit, and because Margaret had said she wanted to break the porch in right. There was food, a quantity of it that spoke to Clara's views on what hospitality required, and something to drink, and the conversation of people who knew each other and were glad to be in each other's company on a fine July evening. At some point in the middle of it, Holt pulled Caleb aside and said, I watched your father build what you've got here. Took him 30 years. I know, Caleb said. You're doing it faster, Holt said. Not because you're smarter, because she's smarter. I know that too, Caleb said. Holt looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded and went back to the party because that was the sum total of the sentiment he had available, and he had spent it. After everyone had gone when Ellis had helped clear and then disappeared to the bunkhouse and the valley had gone dark and quiet. Caleb and Margaret sat on the porch together and looked at the night. Well, Margaret said. Well, he agreed. She was quiet for a while. He could feel her thinking. I have something to tell you, she said. He looked at her. Something I've been thinking about for a few weeks, she said. Something I wasn't ready to say before tonight because I needed to be sure. Tell me, he said. She turned to look at him. The night was dark, but the sky was clear, and the starlight was enough to see her face by. I think this ranch should have a name, she said. Your father never named it. It was always just the Whitaker Ranch, which is practical, but not, she paused, not everything it should be. He waited. I think it should be called the Promise Ranch, she said. Because that's what built it. Not money, not gold, not luck. A promise your father asked me to keep. And the fact that some promises are worth keeping even when there's no practical reason to. Caleb looked at her. The Promise Ranch, he said. If you agree, she said. I thought about it. About his father on the porch watching the road every spring. About Margaret at 5 in the morning with the lantern. About the letter in the mining camp that had taken 14 months to find him. About 7 wrong roads and 1 right one. I agree, he said. She nodded. She turned back to the night. Then the second thing she had been thinking about for weeks. The thing she had actually been working up to. The one that required more courage than she typically acknowledged. Requiring, she said. Caleb. Yes. She took a breath. It was the most uncertainty he had ever seen in her posture in one single breath. I think there might be a child coming, she said. I'm not certain yet, but I think so. The night held very still. He turned to look at her. She was looking at her hands. The ring on her left hand caught the faint starlight. Margaret, he said. I know it's, she started. Margaret, he said again softer. Look at me. She looked at him. He put his hand over hers. "That," he said, "is the best thing you have ever said to me. And you have said extraordinary things to me." The tension in her posture released. Not completely, she was who she was, and complete release was not in her vocabulary, but enough. "You're sure," she said. "I have never been more sure of anything in my life," he said. He held her gaze. "We're going to be all right. Better than all right." She looked at him for a long moment. And then she did something she had only done a handful of times in all the months he had known her. She leaned into him just slightly, just enough, and let herself be held. He put his arm around her, and they sat on the porch of the house they had built on the land his father had kept faith with, above the valley that had watched both of them come through harder things than most people ever faced. The years that followed were not without difficulty. The ranch had its hard seasons, drought years when the water in the creek ran low, winters that tested every repair they had made, markets that moved against them in ways they couldn't control and could only outlast. There were days when Caleb lay awake in the dark running numbers that didn't add up and feeling the old weight of inadequacy pressing down on him. And there were days when Margaret was so tired that even her remarkable discipline couldn't fully hold the exhaustion at bay. But they were never in it alone. The Promise Ranch grew. Not explosively steadily, the way healthy things grow by consistent attention and honest work, and the kind of patience that comes from having both people in a partnership understand that they are building something larger than themselves. Ella stayed on and eventually brought a wife, a quietly capable woman named Ruth, who had grown up on a farm and who took to the work as naturally as water takes to a channel. The herd expanded. The land was well managed. The name they gave it spread through the valley the way names spread when they fit easily, naturally, until everyone was using it as though it had always been there. Richard Caldwell moved his operations east eventually. No single thing drove him away. It was the accumulation, the legal defeats, the failure to crack the Whitaker operation, the way the community had shifted around Margaret, and by extension around the ranch, so that any move against it now carried a social cost he wasn't willing to pay. He left without ceremony and without acknowledgement, the way defeated men prefer to depart. No one at the Promise Ranch mentioned his name after that. The child. Margaret had suspected that July night was born the following March, a daughter born in the same farmhouse where Thomas Whitaker had spent his last years in the room that Margaret had occupied since the week she arrived. They named her Clara for reasons that required no explanation to the woman who, upon hearing the name, made the same sound she had made at the wedding. Clara Whitaker grew up knowing the ranch, the way children who grow up working places know them in the bones in the body, in the particular knowledge of where the ground changed and how the wind moved and which animals had personalities worth respecting. She grew up knowing two things about her parents that she could not have articulated as a child, but understood by the time she was old enough to understand anything: that her father was a man who had made serious mistakes and come back from them through consistent daily effort, and that her mother was the most capable and principled person she had ever known. She grew up, in other words, knowing exactly who she wanted to become. On the morning of the 10th anniversary of Caleb's return to the valley, he woke before dawn, which was not unusual, and walked out to the porch, which was not unusual, and stood looking at the land in the pre-dawn dark, which was. Margaret appeared in the doorway behind him. "Couldn't sleep," she said. "I was thinking," he said. She came out onto the porch and stood beside him. The valley was dark and still and entirely familiar, every shadow and sound of it known to him now. The way the face of someone you have loved for a decade is known, not memorized from study, but absorbed through presence. 10 years today, she said. "You remembered," he said. "I remember everything," she said. "It's a burden." He looked at the land, at the fences his father had built and he had repaired and Ellis had extended, at the pastures that held more cattle than Thomas Whitaker had ever managed, at the hill where his father was buried and where he and Margaret had stood with Aldous the minister and said the words that made the rest of it possible. "I crossed mountains," Caleb said. "Spent 7 years in camps that smelled like mud and failure around men who were all chasing the same impossible thing. I sifted rivers. I broke my hands on rock that had nothing in it." He paused. "I came home with nothing. "You came home," Margaret said. That was the whole of it. He looked at her. She was looking at the valley, at the land they had built together, at the morning, coming up over the eastern ridge, the way it came every day, indifferent to whether they were ready for it, patient as something that has nowhere else to be. "I found it," he said, "what I went looking for." "I know," she said. "It wasn't where I was looking." "It never is," she said. He reached over and took her hand, and she let him, and they stood together on the porch of the Promise Ranch as the sun came up over the hill where Thomas Whitaker rested, and the valley filled with light, and the cattle moved in the pastures, and somewhere inside the house, their daughter slept the deep, uncomplicated sleep of a child who has never had reason to doubt that she is loved, and that the world she is growing up in is solid beneath her feet. It was not the life Caleb Whitaker had imagined when he left. It was better than anything he had been capable of imagining. He had gone looking for gold and come home empty-handed, and in the coming home had found the only treasure that had ever mattered, the kind that doesn't diminish with spending, that grows with tending, that survives every hard winter and every bad season and every man who tries to take it from you. The kind that is built slowly and honestly between two people who have both been through enough to know the difference between something real and something that only looks like it. Caleb Whitaker had crossed mountains and come home with nothing. And everything he would ever need had been waiting for him here all along, tended by a woman who kept her promises on land that kept faith with the people who loved it. That was the whole truth of it. That was enough. That was everything.